All right, hi everybody. Hopefully some more folks will filter in. I'm Allie Brandenberger. I run an organization called The Bridge, co-founder and CEO. We are, as they alluded to on the last panel, connecting the cultures of tech and policy and really trying to build mutual understanding between those worlds, so translating between the two. And super happy to be partnered with All Tech is Human and be here today. So I guess I'll just start quickly by framing up the panel. Obviously, tech and policy is super broad, and I think really what the four of us want to talk about today is more tech, policy, politics, and society, and the impact that it's having on culture. So quickly, I will just introduce our panelists, and then I'll let them tell you guys a little bit about the perspective they're bringing today. So Yael Eisenstadt is a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech Digital Initiative. Natalia Damagala is the Data Policy Strategy and Ethics in the Data Policy, Strategy, and Ethics Department for the Digital Culture, Media, and Sport Agency. And Victoria McCullough is the Director for Social Impact and Public Policy at Tumblr. So Yao, if you just want to start quickly with the perspective you're bringing today.
Sure. Hi, everyone. The perspective I'm bringing today. For your background. Okay. So right now at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative, I'm exploring this exact question, the intersection of technology, civil discourse, and democracy. But I come at this having spent most of my life skating those two worlds. I started my career in the national security world. I was a CIA officer. It still feels weird to say that out loud. And a diplomat, and then I was one of the national security advisors to Vice President Biden. I left government in 2013 to explore what the private sector brings to bear on some of the same challenges I cared about in government. And most recently was recruited by Facebook, and I went in as their head of global elections integrity operations, and promptly left in under 6 months. And so I'm sure there's lots to talk about.
Hi everyone, I'm Natalia Damagala and I work on open government, open data, data ethics for the UK government, Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And I'm really excited to learn what can we do better and how can we make better, more open, transparent policies for the tech sector. And please do not ask me about Brexit. Thank you.
I'm sure you're getting tired of that by now, probably. I'm Victoria McCullough. I work at Tumblr. I've been there about 4 years. Similar to Yale, I started off community organizing. I left college and then moved to Iowa to work as a community organizer for then Senator Barack Obama. Kind of stuck with that, ended up working in the administration until about 2014. And similarly, just had this, most of my through line had always been really advocating and organizing on behalf of of the people, really trying to plug folks in to President Obama's policies and finding ways to get folks to participate. And then moved to Tumblr in 2016 to actually help work on their elections efforts. Tumblr had a long history of really getting folks to advocate around civics and getting involved in participation. And then the 2016 election happened, and the public policy part of my job really took off as all platforms really had to start grappling with what they had basically neglected for 10 years. So I'm kind of in this place, and I think the perspective I'm bringing, kind of excited to talk to folks today, is I'm one of these folks who I think started off really advocating on the grassroots side of things and is now working within big tech, thinking like, oh, am I agitating enough from within? Or should I return to sort of that government community organizing background? And so I just think there are a lot of questions I think a lot of us who are working in some of these places are asking. So just excited for that conversation.
Cool. So excuse us, we only have 2 mics, so we're kind of going to go back and forth, but really want to make this a conversation with you guys too. So we're going to leave about 25 minutes for questions, or 20, so be thinking about those. And there's a big box that we're going to throw around, and you guys can use that as a microphone. But first things first, I think everybody would love to hear a little bit about Facebook. And I think Yael just wrote a piece in the Washington Post this week, but also brings a really great perspective with an awesome background and having worked at Facebook. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about political ads, civil discourse, and the impact that these organizations are having on individuals and how they kind of consume this news. So you don't have to reiterate your op-ed, but I think the important part here is how is it impacting folks here or folks who maybe don't work in either one of these worlds and are just consuming based on their own Facebook feed or Twitter.
I was going to say, there's about 10 hours worth of questions in that one. I'll start actually with the news story of the past few weeks, is political ads, with a caveat that I actually think that's the least important thing that actually needs to be addressed in a company like Facebook. But the reason why I decided that this was the one I was going to actually wade into is not only because that was what I was hired to work on, but because I actually think what's this debate around whether or not companies should allow politicians to actually spread not just skating a line, but debunked and known disinformation. To me, this is a moment that will really define what that company is or is not willing to do. So again, not the most important issue, and happy to get into that conversation later. I don't want to monopolize the mic too much right now. For me, the reason why I started looking at social media at all was because, and I'm just going to tell this little how this got me there story. Some of you have probably heard it before. But I had always focused on sort of these threats abroad, these conflicts abroad, and what did it mean for our security? What did it mean for the US's role in the world? And in about 2015, I started really feeling like, wow, the bigger threat for us and for our democracy is actually happening here at home right now. And to me, it was the breakdown of civil discourse. It was, I had this wake-up moment in 2015, which is going to sound a bit extreme, but when I realized that I had an easier time engaging and having a real conversation with suspected extremists and terrorists along the Somalia border than I did talking to an American with an opposite political opinion from me. And I wrote about it, and I wrote, what does that mean for the future of our democracy, and what's happening here that's exacerbating this tension and this extreme discourse and rhetoric that's, I think, dividing our nation. And so that is what's made me start digging in on social media. And I'm not saying social media is the only reason. This has always been a part of our culture. And the media in general has always helped fuel some of that. But something different was happening here. And so, yes, went to Facebook. I'll give the very short version. At the end of the day, I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in the power of these platforms to really not just let all voices be heard, but also connect people. I have friends all over the world. I believe in all of that. But that is very different from just because you have a viewpoint doesn't mean you deserve the right to have that amplified to 2 billion people because their algorithms decided that your salacious clickbait, anger-filled tweet or post is what's going to keep people engaged. So I think other people have already spoken about the user engagement model and why I feel that's so dangerous, but so fast forward to political ads. Now we have the situation, I'm sure you've all seen this in the news for the last few weeks, this debate about whether or not these platforms should allow campaigns to, I don't just mean skate a line of we all might have a slightly different version of how we interpret news, but a blatantly and patently debunked fake ad, should that be allowed to run? And as I said in the op-ed, I think society at large is the one who's going to have to decide who governs the internet. I think society at large is going to continue to debate where the lines between free speech and what should be allowed on platforms. For me, though, it is these targeting tools that is allowing them to so hyper-target any key group they want with completely different messages and completely different ads. That, to me, is dangerous. So in the piece, yes, I have a hard time listening to the company defend what's happening based on free speech, because you're receiving money for these ads, so you are amplifying salacious and very dangerous content. But more importantly, I want to know who that ad was targeted to. Because the funny thing is, I bet you that ad, which if you remember, and this is not because of who I used to work for, but if you remember, it was a debunked ad about Vice President Biden claiming he made a phone call to Ukraine and offered them $1 billion, which has been completely debunked. But one thought I'll just leave you with. I don't know this, but I assume that whoever ran that ad from his campaign actually did not target it at Trump voters. I suspect it was targeted at Biden supporters to make them so angry and to make them so disgusted and so frustrated that they will just stay home. That is what Cambridge Analytica did. They had a policy of deterrence. The whole Lock Her Up campaign, it was about making you so frustrated with the process that you decide to stay home. And I look at that as a new form of voter suppression almost. Not voter suppression in the traditional sense, but trying to get you to stay home, that breaks our democracy.
Yeah. Okay, so a million follow-ups. I really wish I had had a mic for that. But I think the biggest thing there is the impact on our trust in the process and our trust in democracy. And if we're able to, like, the biggest change, and one thing I'll ask for you guys too, is just how much do you think, like, forget Facebook, Twitter, but just technology generally. I mean, yes, these tactics have existed forever in our culture. Propaganda, you know, we've had leaders that, anyway, it's existed forever, but now the pace at which people can reach anyone way beyond people that they know now is so great. So I guess maybe you guys just want to touch a little bit on what the impact of that, like, fast-moving process has done to society.
Sure. So to reflect on what Yael said, I think it's fascinating to see how the past, 10, 15 years of the evolution of social media showed us that the features of platforms like Facebook, Twitter, that enabled people to organize, to have political movements, sort of oppositional movements in different countries that were not necessarily democratic, how the values that enabled democratic movements back then are now basically backfiring. And I think it's a really interesting phenomenon to watch, but obviously from a policymaker's perspective, this is a huge challenge because we need to, first of all, we need to be fast in responding to those new challenges. And as we all know, governments are not as fast as tech companies, unfortunately. But in the case of the UK, so we've recently set up the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and that's an independent body that aims to look into the biggest challenges that we face, and one of them is online targeting. So what they have been doing so far is basically conducting a review of different regulators within the UK to trying to understand what's the problem exactly, what needs to be regulated, and how it needs to be regulated. As you'll probably know, we are currently heading towards the general elections, which means that we haven't quite had enough time to introduce any new regulation in this area. So what's happening in the UK right now is that our civil society organizations that have a really strong presence, they wrote a letter to Google and Facebook asking to ban political ads for the next, 6 weeks. So I'm not sure if this is going to happen. I'm not sure what are the consequences, but I think it's an interesting dynamics when you had the civil society groups kind of taking ownership of this area.
Wait, quickly, so can you just talk a little bit more about what that letter says? Like, is it no political ads for the next 6 weeks? I don't know if everybody here is familiar, but it's very interesting to think about what if we did that in the US?
Yeah, so this letter has been signed by Mozilla, Everyone, Open Data Institute, and a few others, academic and civil society organizations. And what they basically ask for is that because it's a very delicate period in the UK right now, they would like Facebook and Google to basically not show any political ads for the next 6 weeks. And what they say is that this has happened before in other countries. So, for example, in Ireland, I think it was 2 weeks before the abortion referendum, social media platforms stopped showing political ads. And it was also a case in Israel. So they are giving those as examples of this sort of situation happening elsewhere. And they've asked Google and Facebook to do the same here.
Just a couple things to reflect on. I'm struggling to even know where to start. So a couple things that I think I've been thinking about in the last couple of weeks are, one, I think I'm really frustrated, and I'll speak, Tumblr, and I think along with a lot of others, as a result, we're in a place internally where we are having to think about, well, what do we do with political ads? Because the technical side of this is that parts of Tumblr's, very small advertising base, Tumblr's a good example of a platform, and there are many like us who have had challenges monetizing because we don't collect the type of data that Facebook does. The advertising industry has been fundamentally changed, and it's made it really difficult for platforms like ours to advertise. But it does mean that we run on the Facebook advertising network. That's one of our third-party vendors. So even if Tumblr, who is like under 200 employees, decided to ban political ads, we have no infrastructure to look through all of the ads that Facebook is submitting to us and then deciding like which ones we're going to allow or not allow, or even if we decide to not allow, I don't know what that would look like. So that's one of the big sort of questions I think we're having internally. The second thing that, and this is more something I'm just frustrated by, I think I'm a little upset, and I'm speaking sort of just as a citizen. I'm upset that Facebook, I think, and it was sort of hidden behind this freedom of speech, freedom of expression, because that is false, right? Like we know, and there's so much history out there, there's a whole movie out there, that we know that Facebook was not built on like connection, right? Like it was built on grading women on a college campus, right? Like that was what it was built on. So I think that I'm frustrated, one, by that as a female, that like, oh, that's what we're putting out there is the reason, when I wish what they had, what anyone could have done and said, hey, this is just technically really challenging and we don't have any other way, so we're kind of throwing our hands up and telling you as citizens, like, you just need to do a better job of interrogating this stuff. You're just going to have to try to figure out ways to look at this. And I don't know that would have worked. But then I think on the other hand, I'm frustrated with Twitter because then they go to the other extreme. And then we're left, I think, as users, as citizens, being like, are those the only two options? Like, and I think that's what's really sort of frustrating is that why do we just get two options? And then two, like, why don't we get some transparency? And I think we've seen this. We saw this with the privacy conversation. I think actually a lot of tech is just not giving people the benefit of the doubt of saying like, hey, we don't have the answers to all these problems. We can't rid hate speech. Like they're just, some of this stuff is so technically impossible. Facebook has also been a good example of like, you can't even hire enough humans to clean up the internet, which is just such I hate that, always hated that term. But I just think there's been a lot of false posturing that's being put out there that's really misleading. And here we are as people who are really paying attention. You can only imagine people who are already vulnerable and may not paying attention, don't have the same types of resources, same types of education. I mean, I think that's where I'm struggling. It's just like we haven't been given enough options.
Yeah, definitely pick up on that. But also, just quick question: what is the difference between the data that you gather at Tumblr versus what Facebook is gathering? I don't know if everybody's familiar.
I mean, Yael really hit on. I mean, you can on Facebook basically go down to an individual and say like, I'm going to run ads specifically targeting Katie. Like that is.
That's why it's so attractive to political campaigns.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
when
while
Facebook advertising started, it was like, we can do what?
Yeah.
Like, we know, it used to be that you would know data about people because it was 10-year-old data, and like what magazines they subscribed to is literally the data that people were using on campaigns. To now, it's like, wait, we can find out like who their best friend is and what conversation they had yesterday, and their like identification, like everything.
Yeah.
So it just was so attractive on one side that it's like, why wouldn't we use this? And then it's just crazy to.
Yeah, it is. And again, I think Tumblr just has sort of maintained like the option to be anonymous. There's no public follower count. Like we've had a lot of folks who look at the design of Tumblr and say, oh, this is like a largely positive place because people are coming on to really connect over sort of these real connections. But it has made it, we had a period in which advertising was really going well for us. And then there were a couple of changeovers in terms of ownership who were then really being forced to move to the Facebook model. And I think Tumblr was really resistant to that. But it also, at some point, Facebook and Google, too, Google's a big part of this, but that they, just really fundamentally and almost overnight really change advertising that just made it difficult for a lot of companies to compete. So I would say we really collect, you can do, put any sort of name, like it's just very limited in terms of the onboarding of what we're answering. We might sell like the data we collect would be more about things that you're interested in. It's really sort of geared around interest. Yeah.
So I 100% agree with you. There shouldn't just be these two choices, turn ads off or turn them on. And that's a lot of what I write about in the piece. And then I want to get to afterwards sort of the underlying systemic issues that I think make all of this dangerous. But there are a lot of people now, really well-meaning, including, if you read Jack's entire Twitter thread about why Twitter made this decision, it was actually very, very thoughtful and very well written. It doesn't mean that it's the best solution, but it was very obviously aimed at Facebook, because at the end of the day, here's the issue. It is one thing to be able to say that all voters in Ohio ahead of an Ohio primary are going to see the same ads, so that they all start from the same point of whether they're lies, whether there's misinformation, they all have the same ad coming at them, and then they can debate it. Like when you watch cable news, they're not being able, or networks, I don't know all the ins and outs of how it works, but of course ads can be targeted towards a local community. They can be targeted towards a state or a city. But it can't get down to the nitty-gritty level of knowing that you are on the fence between whether you want to vote for this candidate or that candidate, but you happen to have the 5 similar personality traits that Facebook has gathered about you as they have for this list of people. And the reason I'm bringing that up, you're going to hear more and more talk about whether Facebook should ban their custom audience tool, which is one of the things I'm advocating for. A custom audience tool means they've got a list of emails from whatever it is that they've gathered. Normally, they've got them clumped together into some sort of category. Females who are on the fence about Trump, who don't have a college degree. Like, there's a whole category that they've compiled these emails to. They upload those emails into the custom audience tool on Facebook, and Facebook finds all the women out there that match the personality traits. And those are the people that get that ad. That's the danger. That is the level of which, and so the women who might be getting that ad are not seeing the same thing on the same candidate as maybe their next door neighbor is. And so that's the part that I think is super dangerous. As far as banning ads altogether, I'll just say this. In a beautiful world, I actually think it's time to take political advertising off of these platforms. And when I was hired because I specifically advocated the opposite. I do believe, because I think globally, not just in the US, banning political ads gives the tools and the power to people who already have all the access to information, who already monopolize television, who already monopolize newspapers. So it's actually tilting the playing field. Right now, I would just caution in the US, if we decide we just want to stop all political ads, who do you think already has the upper hand? So it will harm the others trying to run right now. But breaking down truth and making it so that Americans have no idea that they're even seeing different things than their neighbors, that's what we need to end. We need to make it a more open, transparent process. And so I agree with you, transparency is key, and that's what a lot of people are really pushing for.
So 2 things that you touched on there. One is transparency and people knowing who has paid for an ad. But I think the other thing that is really interesting in terms of, to use like a super cliche term, filter bubbles, and like putting people into these conversations that a lot of times I think these ads are also used to reinforce people's own beliefs now, and people are only seeing what they agree with. And a lot of people don't know the difference between an ad and an actual just organic post. And also, a lot of people don't care. They see it, they read it, it doesn't matter. Like, how many people click on the ad at the top of a Google search versus the one below it, because that's organic? Like, it doesn't. So I think, but one thing that's super interesting is kind of like pushing these people into these 2 different, like reinforcing communities where someone that's super, like, let's just use Trump, I guess, as an example, but someone that supports Trump is going to see an ad that maybe reinforces their thoughts. Someone that supports Biden will see something that reinforces their thoughts, maybe not even negative about the other one. And then those people then never really kind of hear the other side. And so I guess, can you just talk a little bit about in the UK, kind of like what you've seen and maybe what we can learn here in the US from you all?
So in terms of regulating ads and kind of online harms, we have developed an online harms white paper, which is a proposal of a number of different policy responses to this. But before I go into the details about the white paper, I think what's really, really important when we're making policies that affect the big tech is to actually understand how the tech works. And this is a huge problem. I don't think many policymakers actually know the details, the very details of online targeting that you've just described. And this basically means that if we don't know, if we're not in a constant dialogue with the big tech companies, we can't do anything that will help. Because first of all, we don't want to stifle innovation. We don't want to stifle business. What we want to do is to ensure that they can develop, that they can innovate, but they can do it in a safe way that doesn't threaten our democracy, that doesn't threaten children and vulnerable people. And this is what we have been trying to do in the UK. So the online harms white paper basically outlines all the problems that we've been discussing here and suggests that there is a need for a regulator. And the main kind of point is that we need to develop a code of practice, a code of conduct for all tech companies, and then have a regulator that will ensure that actually all the big tech players just do what they're supposed to be doing rather than trying to damage our values. However, having said that, we are now going towards the elections. So the future of this policy is unclear, but I think no matter what government gets in power, everyone in the kind of political sphere in the UK recognizes that this is a huge issue that we definitely need to do something.
No, I mentioned this to Natalia before, but I recommend, like, it is a little bit wonky reading, but if you are really interested in this stuff, I'd encourage you to check out the online harms white paper. I still think it's probably the beginning, not the end of something. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I'll be really interested to see if we can find ways to mirror it in the States, and I feel like we're so far from it, but it really is this sort of holistic effort at saying, like, hey, government has to take responsibility, parents need to take responsibility, platforms, like, it really sets it up so that it looks like society needs to tackle this. The rhetoric that I think is happening now we're seeing this in press, certainly with governments, but it's this really absolutist mentality. Like, there should be no terrorist content on your platform. Like, if you are, then, like, we will find you. Like, there's and then press it's really surprised me. There's some tech reporters who are really writing about this really thoughtfully, but I think then there are some who just, everyone wants to beat up on all of tech. And I think it's been really difficult for our government because that's how our government is not too dissimilar from any other government. Like, it's mostly a lot of middle-aged white men, like, and they're not as tech savvy, they're not reading this, but what they are reading, they're getting from the news. And the news is saying tech, like, is clearly highly irresponsible. Facebook is Tumblr, is Twitter, like, it's all the same. And I think it's a really dangerous thing because it's not inviting everybody to be a part of this. One of the things that I really loved and have liked, I think Ireland has done this really well. There's some other places, and it was mentioned in the last panel, but it's just the real need for digital citizenship skills, the real need for media literacy. Now in the UK, it's a little bit easier for y'all to do because your system is centralized, but they've mandated digital literacy to go into school so that kids are learning really early on, like, to interrogate what they're seeing on the internet, to think about how to maintain their mental health and well-being. And I think in the States, we really have not done that. We have not. I always use this analogy of if we had a cop on every block in New York City streets, we still would not eliminate crime. And I think there's this idea that's been set up for the public that, like, if we hire all these humans, if we develop the most sophisticated AI, we can just make the internet sort of this perfect place. And it's just not true, because the internet should mirror a healthy city. It should have, like, healthy citizens. People should be voting and participating in, like, what they're seeing on the internet. They should really be actively involved. But it means we've got to teach those skills really across the board. We have to standardize them. They need to be in schools. My biggest fear, and I say this as a kid that grew up in a small town in the South and there was very little resources in my school, I can guarantee you they are not teaching digital literacy in any way. And even from my understanding to talking to folks here, digital literacy, even in New York City schools, is taught very unevenly. That I think one of the things I'm hoping this does, and I hope the U.S. decides to really push on it, instead of just, I do think we need to continue to put pressure on tech, but I also think we need to bring society along and say, hey, like, if they're not going to ban it, if political ads are going to exist on Facebook, let's give people the skills to really come out of the gate really questioning this. And I think we haven't quite given that invitation to folks to be a part of that.
Definitely. And this is something that we've been trying to do actively in the UK as well. So we have a number of programs targeted at citizens, local governments, to ensure that everyone is equipped well enough to understand what's going on online and to know how to deal with it. And I am a strong believer of the fact that change should come from within. So we do try to educate our citizens, but we also try to educate ourselves, because I think if the government officials lack the basic tech and digital literacy, then that's the problem. We can't credibly advocate for it, and we also can't design good responses. So we have a number of initiatives trying to make sure that we have enough talent, we have enough digital capacity within the government as well. And I think, we just need to, regulation is one thing, but cultural change, that is the biggest challenge. Because if people, and by people I mean both citizens and people within the government, if they don't understand why they need those skills and why it is absolutely crucial for everyone to be able to conduct basic fact-checking, to know how to verify if something is legitimate online or not, then we do have a massive problem.
Yeah, so that touches on my last question, which was going to be about what's the role of the individual. If I know you guys all have a bunch of questions, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm just going to let Yael touch on the point, and then we'll go to your questions, so be thinking about them.
Thanks. I know it'd be more fun if we didn't all agree on everything, but I do actually agree on everything you said. I'll say this, since this is a policy panel as well. I know that right now people are outraged, and so they want this. This is what will fix it all. Wow, I just made the lights go off. That was very powerful. I should drop the mic and go. And so what we're starting to see, too, is people starting to argue even amongst the solutions community, right? Antitrust won't fix everything. Data privacy laws won't fix this. But if people are starting to argue, here's the thing, it is going to take a 360 approach to get us back on track. Absolutely putting, digital literacy in educating children, but still the cards are stacked against them right now with the business models of companies like Facebook. So I believe all of that, but I believe government's responsibility is to protect the citizens of its country. And yes, every person in the US government is not a digital native, is not an engineer, is not a software engineer, is not a tech expert. It doesn't mean they're stupid, though. I've actually sat in more than one hearing and participated in one where the questions were actually pretty smart. So here are a few quick takeaways from my thoughts on this. I do not want to punish the whole tech industry. I want the tech industry to flourish, to help continue to make our lives better. However, for far too long now, there has been a blanket immunity across platforms, and I'm not saying all platforms are equal, and I don't ever actually lump Tumblr into this when I talk about this. But I do talk about if a company's business model is 100% about using your human behavioral data that they have spent years gathering on you, even when you're not on their platform, and using that human behavioral data to then train their algorithms to do whatever they can to keep your eyes on their screen, which means they're feeding you more and more salacious content, I say it is time for a government to recognize that this entire debate about whether they're a publisher or a platform, whether they should bear any responsibility or not, is not caught up with 2019. If your company's entire business model is predicated on a recommendation engine that is recommending your content to you, I think you're what should be called the digital curator, and that's where you should be regulated accordingly. And the best thing that I can think of right now that wouldn't be the hardest fix in the world is to make, you can make a threshold, how many users you have or what your business model is. But I think if we could make those recommendation engines transparent, for example, if I got an ad, if I was looking at a NASA moon landing video and the next video that popped up on YouTube for me was a flat earth conspiracy video, if it was transparent that that was recommended to me by YouTube's recommendation engine, as opposed to because one of my friends watched it or I clicked on it, I think that would incentivize the company to try to think about how to make their algorithms a little bit healthier and base them on different sort of metrics than this user engagement model. I know that was a lot to unpack, but I really do believe government does have responsibility to figure out how do we at least put in basic guardrails? And this whole thing of they have complete immunity because of, and you can look this up later, the whole CDA 230 debate is one that I think it is time to get past that. Otherwise, we are never going to protect our society against platforms like Facebook and what it is doing to our mental health and what it is doing to our civil discourse.
I think we could have a whole another panel on CDA 230. One stakeholder I think we leave out of this a lot, and you touched on this a little bit, Victoria, is the press. I think a lot of talk about like reinforcement mechanisms and like understanding both sides of the argument, and a business model where clicks is the ultimate goal is also not that helpful. So I'll just throw that out there and then go to questions. How does David will pass it around? Yeah. Okay, cool. Go for it. And just say your name and your organization if you feel comfortable, and then go for your question. And then pass it to the next person, please.
Andrew Bolson. I'm an attorney, but also founder of the Private Initiative of New Jersey. I'm very passionate about reforming Section 230, but that is for another day. But in any case, you talked about, and I'm very familiar with the changes that are happening at Twitter and Facebook regarding to online ads. But I'm curious as to your thoughts about organic content, and that what they're doing has nothing to do with any organic content, and how organic content is impacting the political arena.
So I'll touch a little bit on, and I hope you guys have thoughts as well. That's why I actually started by saying political advertising is not the biggest thing that I'm concerned about. It is the thing they're making money off of, and so they should not be able to hide behind some, excuse me, BS excuse that it's about free speech. But organic content is actually my bigger concern, because for all these years now, the way they've pushed us more and more into our filter bubbles, the way even you mentioned the press. So I say no to 99% of press interviews because I know what they have to do. I could have an hour-long conversation with them. They have to reduce it down to a clickbait title. Why? So that Facebook users will click on this article. And that, both the clickbait, the media, it's a weird circle, because now the media has to actually, for the Washington Post, we battled back and forth on the title for my piece this last week, because he actually said, well, I have to have it be a certain amount of words so that it will fit onto a Facebook. Like, he had to make it work for Facebook. Unpack that later. But yes, the organic content.
Wait, just really quickly about the media. I also just want to say I think it is very important that we have an active press. So I don't mean anything about that. I just mean the business models about targeting it. Just throwing that out there.
100%. And actually, I think most media don't want to have to play this game of clickbait titles. Facebook's eaten up their entire capability of doing it any other way. But so yes, organic content to me is actually more concerning. And the tools that allow salacious, hate-filled, clickbait things to go viral is actually another thing that I would like to look at, but I don't want to monopolize.
No, I think I feel the same way. I mean, I think that's one of the things we're really concerned about at Tumblr is dealing with more of the content moderation issues that we really still have not figured out how to use both technical means and scaling like humans to be able to do this. And I say that we don't quite have answers. And I think that's the transparency that I wish we could kind of have a better discourse on. Like I feel like that is a big challenge for all of us going into 2020 and with all the elections. And I think that's something that I think our team is probably ultimately going to decide to focus on, as opposed to really sort of dealing with just not advertising just not being as a big part of our business model. I think we are really more geared towards like how are we sort of protecting our users going into next year.
One thing we talk a lot about at the Bridge is the way in which content goes viral on Facebook or Twitter versus LinkedIn or Tumblr. Like, it's not very easy. There was some example about an op-ed Hillary Clinton wrote going into 2016 maybe, and it was on Twitter and like 2 million people liked it or retweeted it or something, and on LinkedIn it was like 2,500. And so I think just like the way in which things go viral or don't is something to kind of maybe look into for misinformation. So I don't know, maybe you throw it to the next person or something.
Awesome. No need to throw. Thank you so much for your insightful remarks. My name is Arushi, and I'm currently a graduate student working on tech ethics and self-regulation. And so what I'm curious about is your thoughts on a hypothesis I have, which is that the head of product, engineering, data science, policy all need to work together for effective self-regulation. In your experiences in your respective tech companies, do you think that's happening? And if not, what is the best path to self-regulation?
Yes, I definitely think it is happening. I mean, I think one of the things that we have done, and I think myself and the head of trust and safety really re-centered user safety. And now we have a weekly with our CEO, with the head of products, and again, we're a smaller company, right? Like, I think that I want to bear that in mind. Like, I think it's very difficult for the left hand to talk to the right hand at some of these big companies. But yes, and I think looking at UK and some of these other really insightful ideas, one of the things the trust and safety person are always doing is reading research. Like, we don't have a full-blown research team, so we're just constantly trying to consume what are the interesting ideas on like product design, like what are the things that maybe some of our engineering team hadn't thought of, but it's really has been recentering user safety at the very beginning of a product, instead of what was happening, and you hear about this all the time, when engineers really, particularly in Silicon Valley, and I think you see this everywhere, engineers were the lifeblood. I mean, there was a real totem pole and ultimately engineers really drove that. And I think now, because of the risk aversion, now because of the reputational risk, like, you're really recentering. And I think at companies that are a little bit smaller, a little bit more nimble, you can actually put that at the top. In the UK, but because all of us are in the UK, we are actually sort of saying, hey, how do we go ahead, even before this stuff is regulation, how do we start as a team really internally thinking about that? So I do think there is a lot of that that is happening. I just think it's probably harder to do at some of these bigger companies.
Do you mind passing the...
Can I just kind of relate to that? I don't work for a private sector company, but I think it's the same mechanism. And I would say definitely yes. And there are three things, right? So there is tech. You need the right tech tools. You need the right platforms. Then you have skills. So you need the people employed for the company or for the government to have the right skills to actually do anything about tech and data. And then you need culture. And by culture, I mean participation. I mean stakeholder engagement. I mean going out to different parts of your company. I mean policy people working together with the tech leads who their only job is coding, but you still need to communicate all the time, and I think that's extremely, extremely important, and as well as actually talking to your customers. So in my case, my customer is a citizen of the UK, and I think going out to the people, consulting them on the policies that will affect their lives daily, that's a key, absolutely key part of any policy process.
I think we have a question here.
Thank you. Kevin Bryan, Keystone Policy Center. I do collaborative problem solving, consensus building, coalition building, so this is a self-interested question. If each of you had one topic that you felt like, if we could just get the right people in the room, we could probably come up with a set of options for how we might deal with this issue. What would that topic be?
Question, I don't know if everybody heard, but the question was if there's one topic that you can name that if you could get all the right people in the room, you think that you'd be able to solve it, what would that topic be?
Okay, so I don't know that I have one, but I'll just give one. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily my top. If we get all the necessary people in the room to figure out how certain platforms could still thrive without the business model of using our human behavioral data to manipulate us, that would be really amazing.
I'd say we have a number of data ethics principles and guidelines and suggestions. And my issue would be how can we actually make them binding, like really, really binding and applicable to the tech sector and to the government?
Yeah, similar. I have several, but I'd go back to the skills, like user skills, teaching that is so uneven across the board and being taught so unevenly. I would love to get platforms in the room and let's talk about building platforms that don't manipulate your mental health. Like there are some really easy ways that product designers have really led that we know work and could still sort of build a healthy, user-friendly platform. And I think a lot of those, the digital citizenship and the digital skills, taking that into product design could be, I think, really sort of fundamentally change how we're doing things.
Thank you.
All right, great. If you want to pass it.
Hello, my name is Bedrhan Sanar. I'm a product manager at TED, responsible for internal tools. My question has nothing to do with what I do. So in responding to that organic content is a bigger concern than advertising and other things. When Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr all launched, it was a chronological timeline of what people posted. And then at some point, and I haven't been on Tumblr in a while, so I don't know if they switched.
It's still that way.
Okay, but for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, they switched to a what they feel is noteworthy timeline. Was there a demonstrable pattern of a behavior change in that? And a follow-up to that is Twitter, I think last year, a few months ago, my sense of time is distorted, reintroduced the ability to have a chronological timeline. Was there also a noticeable change in behavior when that came back?
So that's an amazing question, and you've just sparked an idea. Oh, did everyone hear it, or do you want me to sort of repeat it? Okay, so the basic, in a nutshell, it was when most of these platforms, when they began, it was chronological timelines. You just saw things as people posted them, and then they all started shifting towards deciding sort of what order they were going to show you and and their algorithms decided what they were going to show you. And he asked if there's any proof of how that may or may not have changed outcomes or the way people are talking and whatnot. And since Twitter has actually reintroduced chronological as an option, has that changed anything? So first of all, amazing question, because I've been trying to decide what I am going to actually tackle as a project at Cornell Tech. That might be a really good one. I haven't seen any actually proof either way, but I will say this. So when I went with, I also work with the Center for Humane Tech, and Tristan and I went to the Hill he was testifying for a Senate hearing on persuasive technologies. And a few senators actually asked the question about why can't you just switch back to chronological order? And of course the answer is always because people don't like it. They don't like seeing boring content. They like it more when we show them what they want to see. But I actually would love, I don't know what the data is around that. Earlier on, I was going to ask you, and you don't have to raise your hands, because I wonder if this coincides. I was going to ask, just think about this. How many of you actually hang out, have conversations with, still engage with people who are very much on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you? And then think about, 10 years ago, did you? Because I know even for myself, it has changed. 10 years ago, I had a much broader group of friends than I do now. And so I'm not saying there's a direct correlation. I do think they will continue to argue that people don't just want to see a chronological. Even on Twitter, though, it's not the default. And even if you choose the chronological, it switches back after a week or so. But I actually think it is, I want more transparency around how the algorithms are deciding what you see. Because I do think if there was more transparency around that, there would be more of an incentive for companies not to embarrass themselves by admitting that they're just showing you this jerk that's getting your blood pressure going as opposed to showing something more well-rounded.
There is some research. A lot of what was interesting is a lot of kids grew up on Tumblr. Like we always describe us, we're sort of the weird niche kids at the table. And I think a lot of them ended up being, they're now social scientists. And a lot of them have really studied this, and they have, interestingly enough, but they looked at the reverse or the chronological order, and we really maintained that, maybe at the cost of like monetization, but it's been really credited as sort of, folks weren't coming on to really chase the latest thing, and it created sort of this safer sort of mental health space where folks felt like, hey, like I'm going for this quality engagement with people who are really sort of different from me, and it just maintained this sense of like, oh, I'm connecting with not my friend or family that I know, but like someone who just happens to be really interested in Furbies as much as I am. So I think there's some good research I'll send to you for that.
One thing that could be interesting to look into too is who was in the room when Tumblr decided to keep it chronological and who was in the room when Facebook and Twitter and everybody else switched it. Back to that guy, well, he's gone now, but that guy's question before about if you could put the right people in the room and make that decision, I would assume that a lot of average like sales folks maybe went one way, or maybe Victoria kind of kept Tumblr in line. All right, we are up for time. I speak for myself. I'll be around for the rest of the day.